James Clear, the author of Atomic Habits, one of the best-selling books of the last decade, did not start his writing career with a perfectly designed website, a professional logo, or a carefully planned content strategy. He started by publishing articles on a blog. Those early articles were imperfect. His website had no logo for years. His writing voice took time to develop. His audience grew slowly, then steadily, then explosively. And none of what he eventually built was possible without the imperfect start that preceded it. He tells this story himself in what would later become a collection of essays called The Power of Imperfect Starts. And the story isn't just autobiographical modesty. It's the central argument of the entire book. The version of you that succeeds at something is never the version that waited until everything was perfect before beginning. It is always, without exception, the version that began while imperfect and became better through the process of doing. This book is different in form from most of the books we've covered in this series. It's not a single argument unfolded across a consistent narrative. It's a collection of essays and short pieces, each one exploring a different facet of how to work better, think clearer, build smarter, and most importantly, begin honestly. That Clear published on his blog and refined over several years before compiling them. The result is a book that reads less like a single long lecture and more like a series of precise, well-aimed observations about the specific patterns that separate people who build things from people who spend their lives preparing to build things. In this video, I want to give you the real content of this book, the ideas that have made Clear's essays among the most widely read personal development writing on the internet, organized into the themes that matter most, with the specific practical implications that most summaries skip past too quickly. By the end, you'll have not just an understanding of what the book says, but a genuine sense of what it would feel like to live by the orientation it's recommending. Let's begin with the concept that the book's title is built around, and that runs through everything else it contains. The Power of Imperfect Starts is not, as the name might suggest, primarily about lowering your standards or being satisfied with mediocrity. It's about a very specific and very costly error in how most people approach beginning. The belief that the quality of a start determines the quality of what follows, when in reality the opposite is far more often true. Quality emerges from the process of doing, through repeated engagement, gradual refinement, accumulated feedback, and the patient compounding of incremental improvement. It cannot be front-loaded into the conditions of beginning. Trying to begin perfectly is not a path to perfect outcomes. It is a reliable path to not beginning at all. Clear's founding example is the website story, but the pattern it illustrates appears everywhere. The person who wants to start exercising but is waiting to understand the optimal workout plan before beginning. The person who wants to start a business but is waiting until the business plan is fully fleshed out. The person who wants to write but is waiting for the right idea or the right amount of free time. The person who wants to improve their diet but is waiting until Monday, or the first of the month, or the new year, or after the current stressful period is over. In every case, what looks like thoughtful preparation is actually something quite different, a way of maintaining the comfortable sense of potential that comes with intending to do something, without exposing that potential to the uncomfortable reality of actually attempting it. Potential is safe. Attempt is exposed. Potential can always turn out well. Attempt might not. And for many people, the preservation of potential feels more comfortable than the risk of attempt. So preparation extends indefinitely. The beginning is perpetually deferred, and the thing they wanted to build never gets built. The imperfect start is the antidote to this pattern, and it works not by lowering ambition, but by changing the unit of action. Instead of begin well, the standard becomes begin. Instead of have all the conditions right first, the standard becomes begin with the conditions that currently exist. The beginning is decoupled from the quality of what the beginning produces, which removes the perfectionist's primary excuse for deferral. What happens after the imperfect beginning is where the real magic lies. You learn things through doing that no amount of preparation could teach you. You discover which aspects of the work actually matter and which ones you were worried about unnecessarily. You build momentum, which makes the next session easier than the first. You produce something, however rough, that can be improved, which is infinitely more useful than the perfect version you were planning to produce but haven't started yet. And you build the genuine evidence through the repeated experience of beginning and continuing and improving, that you are someone who actually does this thing rather than someone who intends to. Now let's move to one of the book's most practically useful ideas: the distinction between comparing yourself to the current performance of experts and comparing yourself to where those same experts were when they were at your stage. Clear makes this observation with unusual precision, and it's worth sitting with carefully because the error it corrects is one of the most reliable sources of discouragement in virtually every area of human learning and development. When you begin something new, the most visible examples of performance in that domain are almost always the best performers who have been doing it for years or decades. You see the seasoned blogger, not the blogger's first 100 posts. You see the fit athlete, not what that person looked like in their first month of training. You see the successful business, not what the founding team was doing in their garage before anyone was paying attention. This creates a specific and damaging cognitive distortion. You compare your beginning to their middle or their end. And this comparison, even though it is virtually never conscious or deliberate, generates a specific feeling that Clear identifies as one of the most reliable killers of imperfect starts. The feeling of being hopelessly behind, of not having what it takes, of the gap between where you are and where you could be being simply too large to close. The corrective is what he calls comparing yourself to where successful practitioners started rather than where they currently are. Not could I ever be as good as the person I'm looking up to, which encourages discouragement, but could I do what that person was doing when they were at my stage, which almost always has an obvious, encouraging answer. Yes. The difference between where you are and where they are now is not primarily talent. It is accumulated time spent doing the work. And the only way to close that gap is to do the work, starting from exactly where you are, imperfectly, today. This is particularly important in the era of social media and curated professional profiles, where what is visible is virtually always the polished output of sustained effort rather than the rough beginning that made that polished output possible. Every sophisticated, beautifully designed website you encounter was once someone's first awkward attempt. Every engaging, confident speaker you watch online was once nervous and stumbling through early presentations. The finished product is visible. The imperfect starting point that led to it is almost always invisible, which systematically distorts the viewer's sense of what the starting point needs to look like. Let's now talk about one of the book's central arguments about the relationship between systems and goals, which overlaps with some of the territory of atomic habits, but explores it from a somewhat different angle. The specific insight this book develops is about what Clear calls the problem of living for outcomes. Most people, most of the time, are structuring their engagement with their most important work around the question of whether it produces the outcome they're hoping for, and calibrating their effort, enthusiasm, and persistence based on whether that outcome seems to be arriving. This is a natural way to relate to your work. It is also a reliable way to produce inconsistent effort, because the feedback on whether outcomes are arriving is frequently delayed, ambiguous, and subject to factors outside your control. The alternative Clear advocates is structuring your engagement around the quality and consistency of the process rather than the appearance of the outcome. Not "is this working?", which is often genuinely unclear in the short term, but "am I doing the work?", which is clear and immediate. This shift is easy to describe and surprisingly difficult to sustain, because the mind's natural orientation is toward outcomes, and the absence of visible outcomes in the short term, combined with a process focus, requires a specific kind of faith in the compounding that hasn't yet become visible. The book's case for this faith is grounded in what Clear calls the aggregation of marginal gains, an idea he first encountered in the context of British professional cycling, where a coach named Dave Brailsford built one of the most successful cycling programs in history by focusing obsessively on tiny improvements in every conceivable dimension of performance: rider nutrition, seat ergonomics, pillow quality for better sleep, even the cleanest hand-washing practice to reduce illness risk. Each individual improvement was negligible. Together, compounding over time, they produced results that looked from the outside like a sudden dramatic surge in performance, but were actually the delayed, highly visible payoff of accumulated small improvements that had been building for years before they became apparent. Clear applies this principle broadly. The small, daily, process-focused improvements that feel insignificant in the moment compound into the outcomes that look, in retrospect, like extraordinary achievement. But the compounding is invisible in the short term, which is precisely why the process focus requires faith, and why most people abandon it before the compounding has had time to produce visible results. This connects directly to the imperfect start. The imperfect beginning initiates the compounding process. It is the first small marginal gain, humble and unremarkable, that sets everything else in motion. Without it, all the subsequent compounding is simply not available. Now let's talk about what the book has to say about focus and priority, because this is an area Clear develops with real specificity, and where his observations are particularly useful in a world of overwhelming information and competing demands. The book makes a deceptively simple argument. The single most important factor in producing significant work is not intelligence, talent, resources, or even effort in the general sense. It is the quality and consistency of your focus on the one or two things that matter most. Most people are not limited by what they are capable of doing. They are limited by how many different things they are trying to do simultaneously, which distributes attention and effort too thinly to produce any one thing to a standard that would distinguish it. Clear draws on the Pareto principle, the observation that in most systems, roughly 80% of the results come from 20% of the causes. In the context of personal productivity and output, this suggests that a small number of activities, probably one or two, account for the vast majority of the meaningful results you produce. Identifying those activities and protecting time for them, at the expense of the many less important activities that compete for your time, is the most direct available path to substantially better outcomes. The practical challenge is that the important activities and the urgent activities are rarely the same things, and the urgent activities almost always win the competition for attention when no deliberate choice is made in advance. Email, notifications, requests, meetings, and the ordinary friction of daily life are urgently demanding without being importantly contributing to the work that matters most. The important work, the writing, the deep thinking, the skill development, the relationship building that requires sustained attention, is typically not urgently demanding, which means it gets consistently displaced by the urgent unless you specifically and deliberately protect it. Clear's prescription is to make this protection explicit and structural rather than aspirational, Not "I'll do the important work when I have time for it," which is the same as never doing it, because the time for it is never simply available. But the important work happens first, at this time in this place, before anything else makes a claim on my attention. This is the morning routine logic applied to output rather than to personal habits, front-loading the most important work to the time when focus and cognitive resources are freshest, before the urgent demands of the day have depleted them. The book also argues something that feels almost radical in a culture that celebrates multitasking. Deep focus is a skill, not a personality trait, and it builds through practice in the same way that any other skill builds. Most people today have severely degraded their capacity for sustained attention through years of fragmented, distraction-saturated work habits. The person who can sit with a single problem or a single piece of work for 2 uninterrupted hours is genuinely rare, and the work that such attention produces is genuinely different in quality from the work that fragmented attention produces. Rebuilding this capacity, through the deliberate practice of focused work in gradually extending sessions, is one of the highest return investments available to most knowledge workers. Let me now spend time on one of the book's most quietly important ideas, which concerns the difference between the systems of the best practitioners in a field at their current level versus the systems they used when they were beginning. The specific error Clear is identifying is this: when people look at how successful practitioners in their field operate, they see sophisticated, optimized, highly refined systems developed over years of practice, and they naturally assume that this is what they should be trying to implement from the beginning. The expert blogger has a precise editorial calendar, a detailed research process, a refined content strategy. The expert investor has a carefully constructed portfolio construction discipline, a specific research methodology, a precise risk management framework. The expert athlete has a highly specific training periodization, precise nutritional protocols, sophisticated recovery practices. But these systems are outputs of expertise rather than inputs to it. The expert built them gradually, adding complexity and refinement as their understanding of the work deepened through years of doing it. Attempting to implement the expert's current system at the beginning is like trying to drive at highway speeds before you've learned to handle the car at all. The system that is optimal for the expert's level of skill and knowledge is actively counterproductive for the beginner, because it requires capabilities and knowledge that the beginner doesn't yet have, and that can only be built through the simpler practice that precedes it. Clear's practical prescription is to start with the simplest possible version of the system and add complexity only as understanding grows to require it. This sounds obvious but cuts against a very strong instinct toward getting everything right from the beginning, toward building the complete system before deploying it, toward the perfectionist's desire to start well rather than start imperfectly and improve. The website without a logo is perfect. Start publishing. The diet without precise macro tracking is adequate. Start eating better. The exercise program without a detailed periodization plan is fine. Start moving. The business without a polished pitch deck is ready to talk to customers. Start talking. The simplest viable version of the thing is always available. The complete, refined version never is, because completion and refinement are products of starting rather than prerequisites for it. Let's now look at what the book says about learning, because Clear's essays on this topic are among the most practically useful things he's written, and they deserve careful treatment. The most important learning insight in the book concerns the difference between learning about something and learning from doing something. Most people's default learning mode is the first. They read, they watch, they listen, they study, they take courses, they consume information about the thing they want to do. This kind of learning has real value. but it has a specific and serious limitation. It cannot teach you the things that only experience can teach you, the things that only become visible when you are actually doing the work and encountering the specific, unpredictable reality of what the work requires. The person who has spent a year reading about swimming and the person who has spent a year swimming are not equivalently prepared to swim. The person who has spent a year reading about writing and the person who has spent a year writing are not equivalently prepared to write. The information learned from doing is fundamentally different in kind from the information learned from studying, and no amount of pre-doing study can substitute for it. Clear's prescription is to front-load doing rather than front-loading studying. Not to study until you're ready to do, but to start doing as soon as you have the most minimal baseline of necessary information, and to use the experience of doing to identify specifically what you need to learn next. This creates a learning cycle that is driven by the actual demands of the work rather than by a theoretical curriculum about the work, and it produces knowledge that is immediately applicable because it was generated by application rather than by abstraction. This is connected to an idea Clear discusses about the role of mistakes in the learning process. Genuine mistakes, the kind that happen when you're actually trying to do something and it doesn't work the way you expected, are more educationally valuable than almost any other form of learning input. They are specific, contextually relevant, and viscerally memorable in a way that abstract study almost never is. The writer who publishes a piece and notices that readers don't engage with the section they spent the most time on learns something that no writing course could have taught them. The entrepreneur who pitches their product and gets rejected for a reason they didn't anticipate learns something that no business school case study could have replicated. The reluctance to make mistakes, which perfectionism produces by making mistakes feel like evidence of inadequacy, therefore directly undermines learning and produces the specific outcome it was trying to prevent. People who know less, not more, because they haven't accumulated the mistake-generated learning that genuine competence requires. Now let's talk about the book's treatment of the 80-20 principle, which Clear explores in a chapter that I think is one of the most nuanced treatments of this idea I've encountered anywhere. The standard version of the Pareto principle, as applied to productivity, suggests that you should identify the 20% of activities producing 80% of your results and focus exclusively on those, eliminating the other 80% as waste. This is useful advice in some contexts, but Clear points out a limitation that is rarely acknowledged. The 80-20 distribution is not fixed. What constitutes the 20% that produces most of your results changes as your capabilities, context, and goals change. The activities that drive 80% of your results today are not the same activities that drove 80% of your results at an earlier stage, and they may not be the same activities that will drive them at a later stage. This has a practical implication that the simple, eliminate the 80% prescription misses. Some of what looks like unproductive experimentation in the 80% is actually how you discover the new 20% that will eventually replace the current one. The blogger who tries many different topics before finding the ones that resonate with their audience is not wasting time on the 80%. They are in the process of discovering a new 20%. The entrepreneur who experiments with many different approaches before finding the one that works is not being inefficient. They are doing the necessary empirical work that precedes knowing what to optimize. The practical wisdom Clear draws from this is to apply different orientations at different stages of developing something. In the early stages, breadth and experimentation serve you better than premature optimization, because you don't yet know what the 20% is. In the later stages, Once you have the empirical evidence from early experimentation to identify what's actually working, depth and focus serve you better than continued breadth. The error of applying the optimization orientation too early, before the evidence to identify what to optimize is available, is as costly as the error of continuing to experiment when the evidence already clearly points to what needs to be scaled. Let me now spend some time on the book's ideas about the relationship between quantity and quality in creative and productive work, because this is an area where Clear makes an argument that many people find counterintuitive and that I think deserves careful examination. The argument builds on a well-known study of photography students that has been cited in various forms in multiple places, though the details vary in different tellings. The essential finding, however real the specific study, reflects something that practitioners across many fields have confirmed through experience. Students who focused on producing the maximum quantity of work, without worrying about whether any individual piece was excellent, tended to produce work of substantially higher quality by the end of a defined period than students who tried to produce the single best piece they could, focusing on quality rather than quantity. The mechanism is the same one that runs through the entire book. Quality is a product of iteration, repeated engagement, accumulated feedback, gradual refinement, the compounding of small improvements across many attempts. A student who produces 100 photographs, regardless of the quality of any individual one, has had 100 opportunities to notice what works and what doesn't, 100 opportunities to adjust their technique, 100 opportunities to build the eye and the hand coordination that skilled photography requires. A student who produces 3 photographs, each carefully considered and refined, has had 3 such opportunities. The quantity-focused student is running far more cycles of the learning loop, and more cycles of the learning loop produces faster development of the skills that quality requires. This doesn't mean quantity is the goal in itself. It means that in the early and middle stages of developing any skill or building any creative body of work, focusing primarily on producing the next piece, rather than obsessing over the perfection of the current one, tends to produce better results faster. The excellent photographer, writer, teacher, and entrepreneur almost all got there by producing lots, not by producing perfectly. Before we move toward the final sections, let me address something the book touches on that is particularly relevant in the contemporary information environment: the problem of consuming too much and producing too little. Clear makes an observation about the consumption-production ratio in knowledge workers' lives that is sharp and specific. Most people who want to develop expertise, build something, or improve their work spend far more time consuming information about how to do these things than they spend actually doing them. This isn't irrational in small doses. Consuming high-quality information about your field accelerates learning and reduces unnecessary mistakes. But beyond a certain point, which most people exceed significantly, additional consumption produces diminishing returns while displacing the production that would actually build the capability consumption is supposedly preparing you for. The specific trap is what he calls learning without application, accumulating knowledge about a domain without the experiential feedback that converts knowledge into genuine understanding. Reading 10 books about running will not make you a better runner. Running, with some guidance from good sources, will. Reading 20 books about writing will not make you a better writer. Writing, with some reading to learn from and some feedback to calibrate against, will. The consumption builds conceptual knowledge. The production builds actual capability. And actual capability is what enables the outcomes that most people say they want when they describe why they're consuming so much content about how to build things. The practical prescription is to actively manage your consumption-production ratio, ensuring that for every significant period of consuming information about your domain, you have corresponding periods of producing in your domain. This isn't an equal balance. The appropriate ratio varies by domain, by stage of development, and by how much genuinely novel information is currently available in your specific area. But most people's current ratio errs very significantly toward consumption, and shifting it meaningfully toward production almost always produces better development of actual capability than shifting it further toward consumption. Let's now address the honest limitations of this book, because a fair treatment requires nomming them. The book is a collection of essays rather than a unified argument, and this format has genuine costs alongside its genuine benefits. Each essay is largely self-contained, which makes the book approachable and easy to read in segments. But it also means that the ideas don't build on each other in the sustained way that a more tightly integrated book would allow. Some topics are returned to more than once without significantly deepening the treatment from the first encounter. And because the essays were originally written as standalone blog posts, some are more developed and more original than others, and the less developed ones occasionally feel like padding relative to the book's best material. The book also covers territory that readers who have spent time in the personal development and productivity space will find familiar. Imperfect starts, Pareto principles, systems versus goals, and the value of iteration are all ideas that appear in various forms across much of the literature in this genre. Clear treats them with clarity and specific examples, but he is not usually claiming to have originated these ideas, and readers who have already encountered them in other books may find the book's contribution to be more in presentation than in novelty. These are legitimate caveats. They don't negate the book's value, but they appropriately calibrate expectations about what kind of experience engaging with it provides. What remains genuinely valuable is substantial, and for many readers, directly actionable. The specific argument about comparing yourself to where experts started rather than where they currently are is both simple and genuinely useful in reducing the discouragement that kills imperfect starts before they happen. The treatment of consumption versus production imbalances is specific and actionable in a way that helps many readers make an immediate adjustment to how they spend their time. The discussion of when the 80-20 principle helps versus when it hurts is more nuanced than most treatments of the topic. And throughout all of it, the accumulated weight of Clear's examples and observations builds a genuine case for the imperfect start as not just acceptable, but as the necessary and optimal beginning of almost anything worth doing. Let's run through some of the specific chapters and ideas from the book that deserve direct mention, but that we haven't yet covered. The chapter on the difference between being in motion and taking action directly addresses something that most people experience but rarely name: the seductive feeling of productive progress that comes from activities that look like doing the thing but actually substitute for doing the thing. Writing an outline feels like writing. Researching equipment feels like training. Creating a detailed plan feels like executing it. These things are genuinely useful up to a point, and Clear doesn't dismiss them. But he makes the specific distinction that action, as distinct from motion, is the thing that produces an outcome. Motion doesn't produce outcomes. Action does. And the tendency to substitute extensive motion for action is one of the most reliable ways that imperfect starts get perpetually deferred in favor of comfortable preparation. The chapter on genetic factors in talent is unusually honest for a productivity book. Clear acknowledges directly that genetics play a role in determining where people end up in any competitive domain, while arguing that the implications of this are different from what most people assume. Genetics set the ceiling of performance in any given domain, which varies by individual and is genuinely not fully controllable. but the ceiling is almost always far above what most people ever approach, and the primary determinant of how close anyone gets to their ceiling is not the height of the ceiling but the quality and consistency of their effort. Most people operate so far below their ceiling that the height of the ceiling is simply not the relevant constraint. The relevant constraint is the quality of their process, which is entirely within their control. The chapter on the relationship between preparation and opportunity makes an argument that clear frames as luck preparation. The observation that what looks like luck from the outside, the right opportunity appearing at exactly the right moment, is almost always the intersection of genuine preparation and an opportunity that would have passed unnoticed or uncaptured without that preparation. The person who has spent years building skills, relationships, and credibility in a domain is positioned to recognize and capture opportunities that the unprepared person walks past without seeing. They look lucky from the outside. From the inside, they are the product of preparation that created the readiness the opportunity required. Let's close with what I believe is the most important message this book is sending, taken across all of its essays together. The central gift of the imperfect start is not the permission to be mediocre. It is not the permission to deliver low-quality work. It is not even primarily the permission to skip preparation. The central gift is the permission to begin, specifically and directly, with the understanding that beginning is not the end of the quality conversation, but the start of it. The person who begins imperfectly will produce imperfect work at the start, and then they will improve it, and then they will improve it again. And then, through the accumulation of these improvements, through the specific knowledge that only comes from doing the thing, through the feedback that only comes from putting the thing into the world, through the compounding of marginal gains that only begins when the first gain is made, they will produce work that neither they nor anyone watching them could have predicted from the starting point. The person who waits for perfection before beginning will have preserved a perfectly intact sense of potential. They will never discover whether that potential was real or imagined. They will never know what the compounding of their specific efforts over time would have produced. They will carry, forever, the comfortable weight of the thing they were going to do when the time was right. The time is right now. The conditions are imperfect. The beginning is available. Everything that matters comes after. So here is what to do next. Pick the one thing you have been preparing to begin but have not yet begun. Identify the absolute smallest, most immediately available, most genuinely imperfect version of beginning it. Not a plan for it, not more research into it. The beginning itself, the first sentence, the first session, the first conversation, the first version. Do that one thing before you do the next thing that will seem more urgent. Do it today. Do it imperfectly. Let the beginning be exactly as imperfect as it needs to be. Because everything that comes after it is better than everything that comes before. Thanks for watching all the way through. The imperfect start is waiting. It always has been. Let me go considerably deeper into several areas that the book covers richly, and that deserve more careful treatment than a first pass allows. One of the most intellectually interesting chapters in the book concerns what Clear calls the plateau of latent potential, an idea we touched on briefly in the Atomic Habits context, but that this book develops through a different angle. The specific mechanism he describes is this. In almost any complex undertaking, the early phase of effort produces results that feel disproportionately small relative to the effort invested. You practice the guitar for a month, and you can play 3 chords badly. You build a website for 2 months, and you have a handful of visitors a week. You train for 2 months, and you look essentially identical to when you started. This early phase, where visible progress is minimal despite real effort, is where the vast majority of people stop. The people who continue past this phase, who keep doing the work through the valley of disappointment where visible results haven't yet caught up with accumulated effort, are the ones who eventually experience the sudden, steep upward curve that looks from the outside like a breakthrough, but is from the inside the visible payoff of all the invisible work that was done during the plateau. The breakthrough is real, but it is not what it appears to be from the outside. It is not a sudden emergence of talent or insight or luck. It is simply the moment when accumulated learning and accumulated effort cross the threshold needed to produce visible outcomes. Understanding this mechanism changes your relationship with the plateau dramatically. Instead of interpreting minimal early results as evidence that you are not good enough or that the approach isn't working, you can interpret them as evidence that the compounding process is running correctly and hasn't yet reached the threshold of visible output. The effort is not wasted. The learning is accumulating. The potential is building. The curve is just not yet steep enough to see. This reframe is one of the most powerful gifts the imperfect start can give you. When you have begun, however imperfectly, you are somewhere in the compounding process rather than still at the starting line. The plateau feels different when you know you're inside the process rather than waiting to begin it. Let's also spend more time on what Clear has to say about identity and the relationship between who you believe yourself to be and what you are capable of sustaining. Because this is a theme that runs through his work across this book and Atomic Habits, and that is worth examining from the angle this book takes. The specific insight Clear develops here concerns the difference between goal-based identity and process-based identity. A goal-based identity says, I am someone who wants to achieve X. A process-based identity says, I am someone who does Y. The difference matters enormously for what happens when progress is difficult or slow. The person with a goal-based identity can lose the identity if the goal seems unreachable or no longer relevant. The person with a process-based identity keeps the identity as long as they keep doing the process, regardless of whether the outcomes they were hoping for have materialized. The writer who identifies as someone who writes every day keeps writing even when the writing isn't producing the results they wanted, because the identity is in the doing rather than in the achieving. The runner who identifies as someone who runs every day keeps running even through periods when fitness isn't visibly improving, because the identity is maintained by the act rather than by the visible metric. This makes the identity extraordinarily durable in ways that outcome-based identity can never be, because outcomes are not always within your control, while the practice almost always is. And the imperfect start is where every process-based identity begins, with one session, one piece, one run that was done imperfectly, that didn't produce a dramatic outcome, that established in the most minimal possible way the beginning of the evidence that you are this kind of person. That evidence accumulates with every repetition until the identity is genuine rather than merely intended. The book also develops an idea about what Clear calls decision-making under uncertainty that is worth examining separately from the broader productivity content. The specific insight concerns how to make good decisions when the outcome of the decision won't be visible for a long time, which is the situation that most important life decisions actually occupy. Most people, when faced with this kind of decision, try to predict the outcome as accurately as possible before committing. This is rational up to a point, but it hits a ceiling quickly. In genuinely uncertain domains, the information available before acting is almost always insufficient to make prediction reliably accurate, regardless of how much more of it you gather. After a certain point, additional information gathering is reducing uncertainty by diminishing amounts while delaying the action that would produce the most relevant information. The direct experience of trying. Clear's prescription for this situation is what he calls betting on the process rather than predicting the outcome. Instead of asking, "Will this work?" which is often genuinely unknowable in advance, ask, "Is this the right process?" which is often more accessible based on evidence from analogous situations, and which produces a more durable commitment once made. A writer who has committed to writing every day has not predicted whether any particular piece will succeed. They have committed to a process that is known to produce improvement and to eventually produce pieces that connect with readers. The process is reliable even when individual outcomes are not. Committing to the process is therefore a more defensible and more durable decision than trying to predict which individual outcome will succeed. Let me also discuss a dimension of the book that is easy to underestimate: its treatment of environment design as a tool for making good habits easier and bad habits harder. Clear returns to this theme in multiple essays and develops it with specificity that makes it genuinely useful rather than merely descriptive. The core observation is one we've seen elsewhere in this series. Your environment is doing continuous, invisible work on your behavior, making some actions more available and some less, cueing certain behaviors through proximity and visibility, and reducing or increasing the friction associated with both your best and worst habits. Most people make changes to their behavior without making changes to their environment, which means they're relying on willpower to overcome an environment that is still working against the change they're trying to make. Clear's examples in this book are specific and immediately replicable. If you want to read more, put a book on your pillow rather than your phone. If you want to eat better, place fruit on the counter and put snacks behind cabinet doors where they require an extra step to access. If you want to exercise more, sleep in your workout clothes on the nights before morning workouts. If you want to reduce social media use, delete the apps from your home screen so that accessing them requires a deliberate search rather than an automatic tap. None of these changes are dramatic. Each one represents a tiny shift in friction, making the desired behavior slightly easier and the undesired behavior slightly harder. But tiny shifts in friction compound over thousands of small daily decisions in the same way that everything else in this book composes. Slowly, invisibly, until the accumulated effect is substantial. The imperfect start applies here too. You don't need to redesign your entire environment before beginning. Pick one thing, one environmental change that would make your most important habits slightly easier to begin, and make that one change today. Let the environment help rather than demanding that your willpower do all the work. Let me add one more section that addresses something I think is among the most practically important ideas in the entire collection of essays: Clear's treatment of the distinction between being busy and being productive. This is a distinction that many writers have made, but Clear's specific contribution is to make it concrete and testable. The key question is not, "Am I busy?" but "Is what I'm doing moving the needle on something that genuinely matters?" Most people can, if pressed, describe the 2 or 3 things that, if they did them consistently and well, would produce most of the meaningful outcomes they're trying to achieve. And most people can also honestly acknowledge that a significant fraction of their time, perhaps the majority of it, is occupied by things that are not in those 2 or 3 categories, however genuinely busy those things make them feel. The busyness trap is particularly insidious because it doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like effort. You are doing things. There is visible activity. You are tired at the end of the day. But if the things you're doing are not the things that actually produce the outcomes that matter most, then the busyness is substituting for productivity rather than being equivalent to it. Clear's prescription is to make explicit, in writing, what the 2 or 3 things are that would produce most of your meaningful outcomes if done consistently, and then to audit honestly how much of your actual time is being spent on those things versus on everything else. For most people, this audit is uncomfortable because it reveals a significant gap between where their effort is going and where the most important work lies. But making the gap visible is the first step toward closing it, and closing it, even partially, tends to produce results that the previously scattered effort never could. The Pareto principle applies here in its most direct form. 2 or 3 activities, consistently practiced, will produce 80% of your meaningful results. Everything else, however busy and however genuine, produces the remaining 20%. Identifying the 2 or 3 and protecting time for them, ahead of everything else, is the single most direct available path to significantly better outcomes regardless of how much raw effort you currently apply. Now let's talk about something the book addresses indirectly, but that I think deserves more explicit treatment: the relationship between perfectionism and the fear of being seen. When people wait for the perfect beginning before they start, one of the most honest reasons, though rarely articulated directly, is that beginning exposes you. Once you've put something into the world, or committed to an attempt in front of other people, the protective ambiguity of potential is gone. You are now someone trying to do something, and you can be seen succeeding or failing at it. The perfectionist's instinct to make the beginning perfect before it's visible is at least partly an instinct to reduce the vulnerability of being seen in the attempt. This connects to what BREN Chinese letter Brown calls the courage to be imperfect, though Clear comes at it from a productivity angle rather than a psychological one. He is essentially arguing that the willingness to be seen trying, before you know how the trying will turn out, before you're confident in the quality of what you're producing, before the outcome is secure, is one of the primary differentiators between people who build things and people who intend to. The imperfect start is an act of courage dressed up as a productivity strategy. Not the dramatic courage of grand gestures, but the quieter, more sustainable courage of showing up before you're ready and doing the work anyway, visible in your imperfection, committed in your intent, trusting that the process you've begun will eventually produce something worth having been seen working toward. Let me close this section with something Clear says near the end of one of his best essays in this collection, which I want to paraphrase rather than quote, but which I think captures the heart of everything this book is trying to say. The person you are becoming is not produced by the intentions you hold or the plans you make. It is produced by the actions you take, repeated over time, in the direction of something that genuinely matters to you. Every action, however small and however imperfect, is a vote for the kind of person you're choosing to become. And the only actions that count are the ones you actually take, not the ones you're planning to take when the conditions improve. The conditions will never be ideal. The beginning will always be imperfect. The work will always be harder and slower than the plan predicted. And none of that is a reason to wait. It is simply a description of what the process of building something real actually looks like, from the inside, for everyone who has ever built anything at all. Your imperfect start is available right now. Whatever you've been waiting to begin is waiting to be begun. The time between now and the moment you start is the only waste. Thanks for watching all the way through. Start imperfectly. Start now. Let me add one final extended section on something that runs beneath the surface of the entire book, but that Clear never quite states as directly as I think it deserves: the relationship between the imperfect start and self-trust. Self-trust is the foundation of productive action, and it is not primarily built through success, though success contributes to it. It is built through the experience of keeping commitments to yourself, which is a different thing. You can fail at something while still building self-trust if the failure happened because you genuinely tried rather than because you avoided trying. You can succeed at something while damaging self-trust. If the success happened in conditions you arranged to make failure almost impossible, which means the success is not really evidence of your capacity. What builds self-trust is the experience of doing what you said you would do, when the doing was genuinely uncertain, when you didn't know how it would turn out, when it would have been comfortable and easy to wait a little longer for better conditions. The imperfect start, done in the face of genuine uncertainty and genuine imperfection, is one of the most reliable self-trust building experiences available, specifically because it is done in conditions where not doing it would have been easier. Every imperfect start is evidence that you are someone who can begin things that are uncertain. Every continued effort through the plateau of minimal visible results is evidence that you are someone who can persist when persistence is uncomfortable. Every piece of rough early work, put into the world before it was ready, is evidence that you are someone who can be vulnerable to evaluation before the outcome is secure. These pieces of evidence accumulate, not into confidence in the sense of certainty that things will work out, but into the quieter, more durable confidence of knowing that you are capable of beginning things, continuing things, and producing things, regardless of how the specific outcome turns out. And this kind of confidence, built through the specific experience of doing rather than through the abstract conviction that you could do, is what enables the kind of sustained, courageous, imperfect action that eventually produces the outcomes that confident people appear to have always had. This is the deepest magic of the imperfect start, and it is available to anyone willing to take it. Not the magic of guaranteed outcomes. The magic of becoming, through the accumulation of genuine attempts, the kind of person who has genuine reasons to believe in their own capacity to make things happen. The person who takes the imperfect start is not betting on a specific outcome. They are investing in a specific kind of identity. The identity of someone who begins things, someone who does the work, someone whose evidence about their own capacity comes from accumulated action rather than from potential still waiting to be tested. That identity, once genuinely built, is one of the most valuable things a person can possess. And it begins, without exception, with an imperfect first step taken before everything is ready. You already know what your first step is. You've known for a while. The question is only whether today is the day you take it. I think it is.